Hello, and welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington. And today I'm very excited about this conversation. And it feels actually quite personal. I grew up in a feminist household, thinking about girls fighting for women. And my belief was always that boys and men had it easier. But if I'm honest, it went deeper than that. I also grew up seeing boys as something girls needed protection from. And then I became a mother of boys, and I had to face the fact that I was carrying stereotypes about the very people I was raising, that I dismissed their inner lives and cast them as a potential threat. And what I've come to realize is that rethinking how we raise boys is a feminist issue. A better world for boys is a better world for girls. And today's guest had an almost identical reckoning, and she turned hers into a fantastic book. Ruth Whippman is a journalist, cultural critic, and mother of three boys, and her book, BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity, is part memoir, part deep dive reporting, and part feminist reckoning. She went places most of us wouldn't, into incel communities, a residential therapy center for young men in Utah, a conference for boys accused of sexual assault, and she got boys of all backgrounds to open up about friendship, loneliness, sex, porn, and what it actually feels like to grow up as a male right now. What she found challenged many of her own assumptions. So, Ruth, welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, looking forward to this conversation. Ruth, I just shared that I grew up seeing boys and men as potential threats, and you open your book with a very similar thought. So, you have this sort of ticker tape of worst case scenarios for your unborn son with your third boy. Can you talk us through what was going through your head at that point?
Yeah, so I was like probably 927 months pregnant with my third boy, right as the Me Too movement was just absolutely exploding online. And it was a time that actually felt like not dissimilar to what we're going through now with kind of Epstein. And it was just this idea that everything we thought we knew was just coming down. All of the good guys were suddenly proven one by one to be like sexual predators, to be or abusers, or even just very minor like misdemeanors, but just there was something systemic that was going really horribly wrong with boys and men. And we were just starting to talk about it in this systemic way. And there I was, like heavily pregnant, full of neuroses, and just thinking, "Oh my god, how am I gonna do this? I'm about to have 3 boys. Men are terrible." It's just had gone from a couple of guys are bad apples to, like, every man in America is a sex offender and an incel and a school shooter and a whatever. And it was just this sense of just, like, utter panic. How am I gonna do this? How can we do better? How can we raise better boys? And also, like you, I grew up in a very feminist household. My mom was a second wave feminist. She was a real like no Barbies, no pink kind of type 1970s, 1980s dogmatic second wave feminist. And I also grew up thinking boys and men are just fine. Everything's great for them. And the real work is in advocating for girls and women. So it was a really conflicted space for me. I was like, how do I both protect and nurture and defend and advocate for my own children and advocate for girls and women in this space and try to be part of a movement that does it better, that we don't just perpetuate these cycles for ages down the line. And it was a really complicated time. And I think it was those feelings that were just so like dark and conflicted and fearful that really prompted me to want to go on this journey to write this book and try and figure out what was going on.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I'd felt very similarly, actually. And I asked my husband if he felt like that, which obviously he didn't. I asked him,
Yeah.
I was like, do you think about whether our boys will ever get into sort of criminal activity or harm girls in any way? And he was like, no. I'm like,
Right.
wow, it's
Yeah.
such a
And
different
that's the
context.
thing. Look, on the one hand, it's really easy to dismiss it as this kind of paranoia, and our boys will probably be fine. And you don't want to tar your own child with the brush of, you're just a kind of predator in waiting. And the best we can do is to limit the damage and hope that you won't turn into a rapist. That's a terrible way to a child's life, right? But at the same time, there's obviously something systemic. There's obviously all these blind spots. Like, I'm sure Harvey Weinstein's mom or Jeffrey Epstein's mom was not like, great, let's raise a predator here. I don't think that they went into that with that in mind. I don't know anything about their family history, but I think there's obviously sort of cultural blind spots that are just being perpetuated beyond any one individual's control. We had to look at this in a kind of systemic way and just think, why is this happening? And I don't think it's enough to be like, oh, our boys will probably be fine and they come from a good family. We love them. They have all these advantages. You know, I think we've realized as a society that's maybe not enough.
Yeah.
One of the things I loved in your book is one of the first few chapters where you talk about the science behind boys and how they, when they're
Yeah.
young, how they develop. And it is so completely different to some of the stereotypes that we talk about how boys are when they're young. Do you want to talk to that a little bit? Because I think it really reshapes our perspective on boys, gives a
Yeah.
new
So
lens.
yeah, it was really surprising to me. So one of the first things I did when I started this sort of journey of looking at men and boys and masculinity was I just was like, this whole question of nature versus nurture, it really dominates this discussion. And it sends us, I think people often use it as a kind of like proxy for another fight. They're like, either boys will be boys, so we can't expect anything more from them. It's just like they're just wired that way. It's testosterone. It's natural that boys should behave badly. And so there's nothing we can do about it. Or on the other extreme, there's this kind of feminist narrative, which is there's no biological differences between girls and boys. It's all socialization. It's all within your control. And just they do badly because we let them do badly. And so I just wanted to unpack what was going on. And what was really surprising to me is that if there is one major difference that is rooted in biology between girls and boys, it is actually the fact that boys are more sensitive and emotionally vulnerable than girls are, less resilient, more vulnerable to harm. And it was a fascinating thing. I looked at the work of this psychoanalyst, neuroscientist called Alan Shaw, and he pulls together all this data that suggests that, like, when a baby boy is born, his brain is about a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl's brain in right brain development. So, the right brain is the part that deals with like emotions and attachments and forming relationships and also emotional self regulation. And because it's a month to 6 weeks behind, if you think about a premature baby, a 6 weeks premature baby versus a full term baby, that's actually a really big difference. And it means that a baby boy's brain is more vulnerable to disruption. They need like more intensive care to get the same kind of outcomes. And you see this, all this data that like any bad thing that can happen to a baby, so whether that's like abuse or neglect or poverty or postpartum depression or poor parenting, et cetera, all have a bigger impact on boys than they do on girls at a group level on average. And so you see these things down the line that like pretty much anything in that domain, girls are better able to weather it. They're more resilient. So you have this sort of weird thing where a baby boy needs a little more care than a baby girl. They need all this very intense nurturing. They need a lot of like emotional support with forming relationships, attachment, etc. But because of our ideas about masculinity and who boys are and what they need, we end up giving them a little less care. So we try to toughen them up. We project all this stuff onto them. So I think people, and there's all this weird research that I found that shows that people handle baby boys differently than how they handle baby girls. Like they get a baby boy and they like throw him up in the air and they're like, hey, little man, and roughhouse with him, and hey, buddy. And like with a little girl, it's almost like they have a different voice. They're more tender. They hold her differently. They talk in more emotive language. And this stuff is so deep. It goes so deep. We don't even realize we're doing it. So what ends up happening is that it becomes a double whammy. It's like the boys need a little more, they get a little less. And so the gap just, instead of closing, the gap just grows and grows throughout childhood. And I think it's most extreme. This can end up being a kind of trauma for boys, like masculinity associated trauma, which is a big part of why we see these kind of toxic patterns later in life.
I love that section of your book, and I looked into it a little bit myself because I was so struck by the fact
Mhm.
that we get it so wrong, that we see
Right.
boys as these kind of robust little creatures, and they're actually
Yeah.
incredibly vulnerable. And I was looking
Yeah.
at sort of data that continues beyond infancy and
Mhm.
toddlerhood into teenagers. The boys get much more affected if they are grow up in a fatherless household.
Yes.
They're
If they go
much
to a
more
bad
delicate.
school, if they live in a
Yeah.
bad neighborhood, if anything, pretty much anything that can go wrong for a child or a teenager will have a greater impact on boys than on girls because of this innate vulnerability. And it's also true physically as well. Boys are more physically vulnerable than girls. They're more likely to die of pretty much every disease. They're more likely to be affected by any kind of neurodisability, any kind of mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, let me clarify that. That is slightly more complex, but in general, yes, boys are more vulnerable to harm than girls are. And yet we put them in harm's way more often.
So the subtitle of your book mentions impossible masculinity. Uh,
Yes.
How would that be different from toxic masculinity? Was
Mm.
a popular phrase these days.
Yeah. So I fought really hard for this phrase, impossible masculinity. I think it's at certain times, and on the UK version of the book, they actually call it toxic masculinity, although they're changing it to impossible masculinity for the paperback version. But what I was trying to convey with this sense of impossible masculinity is that in this moment in which we're existing, masculinity is impossible from all directions. So it was the old story of masculinity has always been impossible. It's squash your emotions, man up, toughen up, live up to this like almost superhuman ideal of a person that shows no weakness or vulnerability in any domain. So that's kind of impossible. Like, how are you ever going to live up to that? But now there's this kind of newer issue or newer kind of story coming maybe more from the progressive left, which is boys and men don't really have any problems. They, as Richard Reeves puts it, they are the problem. It's just like your problems don't matter. Time for you to take a back seat, to be quiet, to let somebody else have a turn. Stop mansplaining. Stop taking up so much space. Stop being aggressive. Stop being dominant. And asking boys and men to change in that way, some of which comes from a very good place, but also it's just how are we supposed to act? Boys are still very much held to the old standards of masculinity. So they're still very much expected to be dominant, be aggressive, make the first move, be tough, suppress their emotions. But now they're also expected to be sensitive and cautious and not to overstep and not to be a creep. And I think so many boys are just like, how do we even act? What do we do? This is impossible.
And where are they getting their models for doing that?
This is the thing. I think boys and men are lost for role models in a way. I think there are, but like anybody, boys get their role models in the home, in their lives, from dads, from teachers, from coaches, those sorts of things. And also from a lot of it is coming from online. And there are some like extremely toxic role models out there in the manosphere, these masculinity influencers. There's Andrew Tate, there's these guys who are putting across this real like muscles and guns, like tough guy version of masculinity. And so I think it's very hard for boys and men to find anything that's healthy and productive and showing something that's going to guide them in a good direction.
Did you find anything?
Any role models that, I mean,
Or any resources that
yeah,
are healthy and
healthy and good. So
we're
there are
counting on you.
yeah, there are a ton of men doing great work in this space. I can rattle off some names. There's like the Equimundo Foundation, there's a Call to Men, there's Christopher Pepper and Joanna Schroeder, who've written a great book called Talk to Your Boys, which is all about having conversations with boys. There are so many men, therapists and coaches and people in the real world who are doing this work and doing a great job of it. But I think their voices are often getting drowned out by much louder voices and even often like seemingly progressive voices that are actually rehashing some really old masculinity talking points in a way that are equally unhealthy somehow.
Yes. Well, when we have our Secretary of Defense model, it's
Yes,
that's
absolutely. And it's been normalized in our politics in a way which is just horrific. You think of things like, for instance, the ICE raids, the way that we're talking about fighting immigration in a sense of this is like the narratives that the social media posts that the White House themselves put out, where it's all about shooting bad guys. This very childish and violent notion of masculinity, which is basically drawn right from like superhero comics. And these are our leaders. And I think if that is normalized in the public sphere, and that's to say nothing of the kind of like normalization of sexual violence and of misogyny, these things which have just become so commonplace and normal in the public sphere, that I think it's just a really complex time to raise boys. I say to my own boys, if the president is doing it, it's really hard to say, well, this is unacceptable. It's obviously not unacceptable because we're accepting it. Here we are accepting it.
I think one of the things that as you're talking, is just reminding me of some of my earlier years with my boys. I remember being pretty adamant that with my eldest, he was going to be really good at caring.
Hmm. Yes.
So I remember buying him dolls and a kitchen set
Yeah. Hmm.
and a pushchair. And I taught him, we worked on, and he loved it. He was great at role play. And I also remember many dads being unhappy about it. I remember him pushing a pushchair. He used to, obviously, there was a bit of his boyhood. So it wasn't just gently wandering with a pushchair. He would like drive the pushchair as fast as he could. And
Right.
so the baby was fearing for its life in the push.
Right. The baby's in the ejector seat. Yeah.
That's right. It wasn't exactly a sort of a meander. And I remember one of our friends saying, "Why on earth have you bought him a pushchair?" And
Oh,
yes, and my husband said, "Why don't you push the baby around?" And it was just quite striking. And I remember we had a kitchen set and
yeah.
he loved to cook. And friends of ours said, "Oh, I'm not sure I feel comfortable with my boy cooking." And we used to do cleaning. The boys loved it, putting a
Yeah.
mop up and down the windows. We
Yeah.
had so much fun. But it actually got a few fathers upset and a few mothers. And then I had my second boy and I tried the same thing and he was having none of it. The baby
Yes.
got thrown out the window. It was all crash band wallop.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was all cars. And I thought, oh boy, it's just too much of the stereotype.
Yeah. Had a similar kind of journey in a way because before I had my boys, I was schooled in this feminist version of feminism that was it's all socialized. There's no nature, and that if we were raising them in the middle of the desert, then boys and girls would equally be drawn to equal things, etc., etc. And their behavior, it's all about socialization. And then it felt like a kind of hubris because when I actually had my kids, my boys, they were obviously like the most throw the baby out of the window, the most Nerf guns and only interested in and marauding and fighting and wrestling. And they were the most boyish, stereotypically boyish boys. And so and I felt like I'd walked into my own kind of ideological trap in a way. It was like, if they're only that way because we make them like that, then obviously the fact that they're like that then becomes my fault. And I don't think it's possible for us to ever figure out an exact percentage of what is nature, what is nurture. I think at a group level, boys and girls do behave slightly differently, and there are parts of nature and parts of nurture within that. But then it's what do we do with that information? And these things, we don't see them as, they're not necessarily incompatible. Like you can be very physically rowdy and enjoy
mm,
play fighting, and also very caring and loving and
yeah,
enjoy
that's right.
nurture. And I think that the sort of idea that you can add these things in has
Yes.
been helpful for me.
Yes. Notice with my boys. So as my boys have gotten older, they've pushed back on me. So I had quite a poignant conversation with my eldest during the Me Too, or just after. And I said to him, we need to talk about consent. Yeah,
Mhm.
probably too
Yeah.
young, but it's good to start. And he turned around and he said, and we were with my daughter, and he said, will you ever have this conversation with my sister?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And what did you say?
It did stop me for a moment, and
Yeah.
initially I said, "No, I didn't think of that because I don't think that's gonna be
Yeah.
necessary." But then I realized that's really insulting, and he said, "Why do you assume that as a boy, I'm gonna
Yeah.
make a mistake and I'm gonna get it wrong?"
Mhm. No, it is really interesting and I have the same thing where you naturally frame the boy as the aggressor and the one who always wants sex and the one who's like always and the girl is somehow defending herself against that. But consent is a really complex thing. And in the book I took, I did a lot of interviews with boys about sex. And what I found was that like boys have a lot of what they call unwanted sex as well. There are lots of situations where boys actually really don't want to be having sex and they feel persuaded or pressurized into it. often to uphold these standards of masculinity where they're like a real man or a real boy would never say no or never like not want to have sex with a and a lot of boys felt really uncomfortable with it. Also, this is a different that's more to do with dating and relationships between peers. But there's also a really horrific minority of boys who are survivors of sexual violence, like very genuine sexual violence. And that's something that we really don't talk to boys about enough. Generally, the perpetrators of that type of sexual violence are not women. They are generally also men. I talked to actually quite a few boys who had been victims of sexual violence, which, and it wasn't that I was going out looking for them. It was something that came up, incidentally. I'd be talking to them about something completely different and they would talk about that kind of sexual trauma. And I think it's even harder for boys to admit it because it's associated with being unmasculine and et cetera, being gay, all these things that boys are constantly defending against. So I think it is a conversation that we need to have with people of all genders. When we have a conversation with boys about consent, sorry, this is the final thing, not just
Yeah, yeah.
assuming they'll be the
Yeah,
perpetrator, they could be the
the
victim,
victim. Yes, yes. And for me, it took having boys to recognize all of these stereotypes and how they harm boys just as much as they
Yeah,
harm. It
yes, yeah.
took me to be confronted by my own children. And in that vein, one of my sons also, my eldest, challenged me on this consent, and he actually gave me statistics on
Oh,
male
good for
rape.
him. He sounds
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah, he
Didn't
did.
he also point out that the prince kissing Snow White was,
Oh,
like,
yeah, the Sleeping Beauty.
non-consensual? Yeah,
Yes.
or
Oh,
Sleeping Beauty, I
He
wow.
guess, yeah.
he ruined a movie for my daughter. She was not happy. Yeah, he did.
That's a good
He
for
did
him.
it.
What a great kid. He
Yeah.
sounds amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he
All
does.
all her
And
ki all Emma's kids are
oh, you're
amazing.
very kind. You're very
That
kind.
sounds lovely. But
Yes.
yeah, I mean,
Yes,
it's
he
really
talks about
complicated.
that.
And also, I mean, I think that again, and this is something that I started to get into in the book as well, which is I interviewed this woman called Aya Gruber. She's a legal scholar and she looks at consent. And this stuff is really complicated. It's not, often we try to frame it as this very simple, like male aggressor, female victim. And those narratives actually can be, I think, it's important to recognize that is a dynamic that occurs a lot. And I think there are many cases of it and they're terrible and we need to wipe them out. But at the same time, there's also way more complex human interactions often taking place. And I think that kind of victim aggressor binary is also really unhelpful, both for girls and for boys. It's this sort of idea that boys always want sex and don't really give a shit about anything else, and girls don't really want sex and they're just like defending against it from boys, and that all they're interested in is like relationships and love, and they'll give sex as like a sort of what is the word, but just something that they give the boy to get
Currency.
love. And I think that those are harmful narratives for both. I think it underplays the importance of female desire and female pleasure and like women's sexuality. And it underplays the importance of boys who really want love and relationships and don't always want sex. I think every human needs both of those things.
Yeah, it's messy. It really is
It's
very
really
messy.
messy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think those stereotypes, they also obviously reach into the stereotypes we have about boys not having emotions and not needing to
Yes.
have deep friendships and not needing
Yes.
to connect on that level. And conversation that sort of I had with I remember it really upset me, and I've talked about it before on the podcast when we talked about boys. My second boy, he was, I think, 8 or 9, and he came home and he said to me, "Mama, what do you think happens when a boy cries in maths class?"
Oh,
And I said, the better side of me thought he gets support from the teachers and his
yeah.
friends. He said, "No. What do you think
That's
happens when a
interesting.
girl cries in maths?"
Oh.
I said, "She gets support from friends." And he said, "And what do you think happens at playtime after the boys cried in maths?" And it was like he
Oh,
gave it to me like a
wow.
puzzle because he loves puzzles.
Wow.
Mm, but it was like, "Oh, no. What happens?" And he said,
Yes.
"Mama, boys can't cry in
Yeah.
maths. And
Yeah.
sometimes we wanna cry." And
Yeah.
I remember saying, "Of course they can." And this was a big conversation. He said, "They can't. You're a psychologist. You think boys can cry and boys can have these big feelings, but it's because 'cause you're a feelings doctor and you can do it. Most of us don't have people that we can cry with. And so this has been an
Yeah.
ongoing
That's
thread.
so sad.
It's so heartbreaking. I
Right,
was
because they're naming something really real. And that's why this
Yes.
conversation is really hard, because you say to your boys, it's okay to cry, be vulnerable. But there are real costs to that for them. And they know those costs. And I think, and this is why I think gets to the real heart of like why a lot of dads are really resistant to this kind of thing. And often I'll do these like book events and stuff, and there'll be a woman in the audience, and she'll inevitably someone will ask the question. I'm really on board with this, but my husband is not on board with it. He wants to like toughen up our boys and teach them not to cry. And I know that the reason why that man is not wanting his boy to cry in maths class is not because he hates his boy or he doesn't want him to express his emotions, but because he knows firsthand what the costs of that are. And he knows that's real, and he's trying to protect his son. He's not doing it, he's doing it because he loves him. And it's the best way he knows to keep his child safe. And so this is like a systemic cultural thing. And I think to gaslight boys on that is not helpful either. To be like, oh, you can just cry and everything will be fine, I think is like not really fully understanding their experience in the world. And it's not really taking them seriously. And so I think this is something that when we talk about impossible masculinity, these boys know that there is a cost to crying in math. And it doesn't make a difference how many well-meaning people like me are saying it's fine to cry. Their 11-year-old peers might not feel the same way. And I think also that girls are often taught, like they're scaffolded really heavily in teaching these skills of comforting a crying peer. They know what to say, what to do. And I think boys are just like not really taught those skills routinely. They're not really modeled to boys. They don't really, the stories they read, et cetera, they don't really learn how to do that. And that's a complex skill. And so he's probably right that at playtime after the maths class, all of the girls are like crowding around their friend and being like, how can we make it better, and helping them. And the boys just don't really know how to do that in the same way.
Yeah, the boys are gonna say, "Let's do something to distract you from that. Let's move
Right,
on."
exactly. Let's move on. And I think, and they're right. I think there is an element of gaslighting if we pretend that's not true for them in this moment. And we can work to change it as a culture and systemically
Yes.
while still acknowledging individual boys' experiences.
Yes, exactly. Because I think that's part of the complexity. I've had another conversation with them recently, just as we were coming on the podcast, and I asked my eldest, how do you feel about talking about your feelings? And obviously I've checked with him. I said I was going to share this with you. And he says, "Man, I'm fine. I don't need to talk about feelings with
Mm,
my friends."
yeah.
And he said, "But what if," and I asked him, "What if they do?" "They don't either." I'm like, "Really?" "Yeah,
Yeah.
they're fine. We're fine."
Yeah.
And then I spoke to my other boy, my younger boy, and I said, "Do you talk to your friends about feelings?" And he's like, "Yeah." I'm
Oh,
like,
that's
"Okay."
interesting.
Yeah. And
And
he's the
that's
one
interesting because
smashing the
smashing
trucks.
the things. Exactly. So it's
Yeah.
like these things
Yes.
are not like linear. Yeah.
No. No. And that got me thinking that we've got to create a society or a community or family where we're not making judgments about how they should and shouldn't be in a way. Because
Yes.
I was doing
That's
that. And
yes.
making assumptions on what they need. You need to talk about feelings, or
Yeah.
you can't talk about feelings, or whatever it might be, that we have to hold those quite lightly too.
Yeah, and
Um,
to recognize the complexity. One thing that I will say though is that a lot of the younger boys, I don't know how old your son is. He's
13-year
15.
old, 13 and 15.
13
Yeah.
and 15. So when I was interviewing boys, a lot of the boys who were like 15 or 16 would be in that space of, we don't need to talk about feelings. Why would
Yeah.
we bother? And they would still rely on their parents heavily for that if they
Yes.
needed to. And then when they got to like college age or older adult men, they'd often be like, oh God, something's missing and I'm really lonely and I don't have this thing that I want, but I don't really know how to get it. And they can't really name it. So it's often they don't think they need it, but then it turns out that they actually do need it. But it's very hard to conceptualize what that world would be like. And a lot of them, I remember this boy being like, I just don't even know how to go about it. I don't even know how I would start that conversation. I don't know how I would do it. And I had this really lovely story of these two boys. I interviewed both of them. They were college roommates. They hadn't known each other before they got to college. And one had grown up in this incredibly like emotionally articulate family, and he'd been to therapy and he had all this language to talk about emotions. And the other one grew up with this like really like hardcore dad who was like, man up, don't cry. And he said that he'd never even cried in front of his twin brother since they were like 5 years old. And he never talked about anything emotional with friends. And he was very like Mr. Tough Guy. And then he'd met his college roommate who'd really helped him to open up and to understand all this stuff and to think that this was valuable. And then actually had like now he was the biggest advocate for talking about your feelings and how important it was. And he was like passing this message on to other friends as well. So I think you're right. It is complicated because we don't want to be telling anyone how they should or shouldn't be with their friends and what they shouldn't be talking about. But at the same time, I think we don't necessarily have to take what they say at face value. They might not even know that's something that is missing for them, you know?
Well, it also sounds given the opportunity,
Yes.
the boys and young men will leap at the,
Yeah.
the chance to learn how to do
That's
these things.
I mean, talk just from the experience of me being an outsider coming and interviewing these boys. I thought when I was going to interview a bunch of teenage boys, I was like, they're going to be just like monosyllabic. They won't share anything deep with me at all. And it was the complete opposite. It was like they were these tightly coiled springs, desperate to share everything that they felt and thought and who they were and the people, the crushes that they had and the things that made them sad and happy and all the rest of it. And it was almost like I'd schedule a 1 hour Zoom call or whatever, or a 1 hour meeting. And then we would just go on and they'd be like emailing saying, can we have another one of I think they felt like there weren't many spaces where they could do that. And they were starved of that kind of connection. And there's another phenomenon actually when that's different because obviously I'm a woman, I'm older, I'm not their peer, right? They don't have to perform anything in front of me. But I think there's this concept which I don't know if you've heard of called jock insurance. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's this idea that like the jock, the person who's like highest on the scale of masculinity, who has all the social capital, the guy who's like captain of the football team and has all the girls and is succeeding in whatever the like expectations of masculinity are, that guy has more permission to be open and vulnerable than that guy is allowed to express his feelings. That guy is allowed to break gender norms. Whereas the guy who's like at the bottom of the pile of masculinity and maybe doesn't have a girlfriend and who, isn't popular, doesn't play sports, doesn't meet all those markers of masculinity, he has to more rigidly like adhere to the masculine ideals. And that really rang true for me. Like you think about, I interviewed a lot of incels, for example, and they're a very extreme example of that. They're like way down on the ladder of masculine ideals. They see themselves as these kind of losers who can't have girlfriends and whatever. And so they're the ones who hold most rigidly to the most toxic ideas, whereas somebody who has all this social capital can be free to be a bit more open, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really true.
The part where you talk about the incels, it's just so heartbreaking, really, in
It
in
really
the book.
was. Yeah.
It really is awful. Do you wanna
Yeah.
maybe talk to our listeners a bit about the incel sort of culture and how
Mhm.
boys end up there?
Yeah.
And do they really think they're losers, or do they think they're incels because the women are just being,
Both.
withholding?
Both. It's a very thinly held hatred of others, which is really a hatred of self, is how I would probably put it. It's a very sad phenomenon on so many levels. So I was really keen to talk to incels because I think that they are, in many ways, like a very extreme but still logical example of some much more mainstream trends that are going on with boys at the moment. So these guys, incel stands for involuntary celibate. So it's boys who cannot or have not had sex. And they are desperate. Generally desperate for a girlfriend, desperately lonely, and extremely depressed, and they congregate in these online forums which are very toxic. So if you go on these forums, it's like the most repulsive things you can possibly see. They're posting the deep misogyny, there's like racism, white supremacy, hideous jokes that like just every like the absolute scum of the earth like type of comments on these forums. But what's so strange about them is that on these forums, alongside this like extremely toxic stuff, there's also this like really unusual deep vulnerability. So these men are sharing their like darkest, saddest feelings. They're incredibly open with each other and they're generally anonymous on these boards. So I think it's almost like it's given them this freedom to this idea that they've given up on ever achieving the goals of masculinity, ever being the kind of, they call them chads, these like guys who they believe are like the square jawed captain of the football team, most successful masculine, whatever. And they, the incels, are like the lowest rung of the ladder of masculinity in their own estimation. They tend to be short, they tend to be unattractive, they tend to be all of these things. But it's almost like they've given up on ever like climbing that ladder of masculinity themselves. And so it's quite freeing for them. They're allowed to be vulnerable and emotionally open with each other in a way that other men maybe are not. And this is what was so strange to me. I was like, I've been looking in this journey of reporting this book, I was looking for spaces where men or boys could be like emotionally open with each other. And I thought maybe I'll find it in a therapy group or in some like progressive something or other. And it was actually in these like toxic incel spaces that I saw the most emotional vulnerability and the most support for they used to call each other their brothers. And there was a lot of like suicidal ideation on these boards, but a lot of young men like stepping in to support their sort of incel brothers at the same time. So it was a real paradox. It was like both the most toxic and the most vulnerable at the same time. And I think guys end up on these boards for a variety of reasons. I think they feel hopeless, they feel lonely, they're desperate for some kind of support, they're desperate for someone to validate their experience, and often they're desperate for someone to hate. I think it makes them feel better. I interviewed this one guy who was like, I think he was suicidally depressed for years and years. He'd had this real tough guy dad who had all these like very strong expectations of like never showing weakness. He hated himself for being like his mom because his mom was like soft and, as he saw it, weak and emotional. And he hated himself for being like her and not like his tough guy dad. And he was extremely depressed. And then somehow the incel forums where he could put all of that onto women rather than onto himself was almost like a relief to him. Like it was a way to find a narrative that located his pain outside of himself. But what's really strange and sad about it is like when I was talking to all these incel guys, you talk to them about their hatred of women. And if you don't give it too much oxygen, if you're just like trying to get past that and look at the pain beneath, then it also crumbles pretty quickly. It's women are terrible, and look at the statistics, and they all have all these like ridiculous fake studies that they quote about how 90% of women are this and women are whatever. And it's all this like faux scientific jargon and it's all absurd. But once you don't give that too much weight, like if you reject the premise of what they're saying, rather than being like, women aren't terrible. And here's another study that shows that 80% of women are actually wonderful. And if you don't go in on their level, but you're just trying to address their like underlying pain, then actually those opinions really disappear pretty quickly. And they just want to share how hard their life is.
The approach you take for so many people in so many
I
situations,
think so. I
if
think
you don't
so.
get caught up in the, but you try to get at
At
sit with
what's
the
underneath.
pain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think it's really hard to do with insults because people, quite rightly, are not willing to just accept someone saying women need to be like raped or whatever it is that they're saying. But obviously, people want to push back on that stuff, and that's appropriate and right. And I think they become their own worst enemy because the two guys that I really spent a lot of time talking to, both of them like really wanted to seek therapy, but they were both like, no therapist is ever going to talk to me. I'm a therapist is just going to be, your problems don't matter. You're an incel, you're a misogynist, you're terrible. And so I think they were like cutting themselves off from any real channels towards help. And it was all full of half truths as well, because I think that it is true that in our culture there is a way in which it's like, well, incels don't, we shouldn't engage with them at all. They don't deserve our help. They don't, and it's like they're so toxic, they don't deserve any help from us. And what have they got to complain about? They're just white men who they're so privileged, and like women's problems are so much worse. And I'm like, God, we're just in these like ever decreasing circles of dehumanization.
yeah, and they do need help because they can
Absolutely.
go to some very bad places.
Yeah, and places which are really dangerous for other people as well.
Oh,
The incel movement is like very associated with school shootings, for example, with mass violence. And so it's just, we live in a world that is so polarized and so judgmental, and we're so keen to score a point and it's just, I think, a very unhelpful way to look at any of this.
definitely. So, in the interest of time,
Yes.
could we hit upon the three C's or what are, in fact, four C's?
Yeah. So people often ask, what do we do about all of this with our own kids? And I think it's a really complicated thing because I think people want, here's your 5 tips and tricks to raise a non-toxic boy. And I think that is not always helpful. These things are not always very simple in that way. But what I try to do is come up with a kind of framework of how to think about each interaction at a sort of meta level. And I call them the 3 C's, which is curiosity, critical thinking, and then the third one is really to care and connection. So firstly, curiosity, I think it's very easy to like panic in these situations in the same way that that in this way of, oh, you can't cry in math class or we can't, whatever. It's just if we can approach our sons with real curiosity about their actual experience in the world and like really allow them to express that rather than getting angry or trying to lecture them or reform them or whatever. I think boys are crying out for people who are just genuinely interested in all the contradictions and all the complexities of growing up male in this moment. And I think our impulse is often to just shut them down and be like, it's not that. And the history of patriarchy shows that men have it so much better than women or whatever it is. And I think that can really get in the way of curiosity. So, curiosity, critical thinking. This is a complicated one, but I think there are so many blind spots when it comes to the sort of narratives in the general culture that are aimed at boys that we just don't even see them. And I think that with girls, we've done a pretty good job as a culture of developing this kind of critical thinking. So any kind of 10, 11-year-old girl can nowadays, like they've had enough empowered Disney princesses and all the rest of it to be able to spot sexism where it arises. So if the prince is rescuing the princess and, she is incapable, or if there's something saying girls are bad at math or girls are whatever it is, I think most 10-year-old girls can like spot that, call it out, have the language to talk about it, can be like, that's sexist and shut it down and not stand for it. Because a generation of feminists or a couple of generations of feminists have done that work of calling out when we talk about body image, when we talk about beauty standards, when we talk about girls in STEM, when we talk about, I think girls have the vocabulary to talk about it and boys just do not in the same way. Boys don't have access to it. And I think some of that is just like doing critical thinking around with them around what they are watching and seeing and consuming. One example of that I give is, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Inside Out. It's the one with all the emotions. And it's this girl, main character, and you go inside her head and all her emotions are represented by these like different like little stuff like dummies or whatever, puppets, I guess they are. And it's this really complex thing about her emotional life. And then you see her mom, and her mom's emotional life is equally complex. And she'll go inside her daughter's head and track her emotions, and the daughter will track her mom's emotions, and they'll all track their friends' emotions. And every time a male character appears on the screen in that movie, they are an emotional idiot. And it's always played for laughs. Is here's the dad, and you go inside his head, and while all the emotion like puppets are just like have their feet up on the desk and drinking beer and watching the game and like totally checked out. And the dad doesn't know what his daughter's thinking. The dad's an idiot. And same with the boy in the stories. And I was watching this with my 6-year-old at the time son, and I was like, what are we telling him here? That like everyone has a complex emotional life except for him, except for men. Men are idiots, whatever it is. And I'm like, if that was a stereotype about a girl, a sexist stereotype about a girl in a mainstream like Pixar movie, then we would never stand for it. We would call it out in a heartbeat, and a young kid could call it out as well. But with boys, we give it a pass. So it's just developing those like critical thinking skills in ourselves and in them to see this stuff, to like spot it and be like, hang on a second, this is not okay. And then talking to our kids about it and giving them a language to talk about it. And making it okay, like giving them permission to talk about this stuff, like vocabulary and permission to talk about the ways in which these harmful stereotypes affect them. So that's one
Can I
thing.
add to that? Because that's such a good point. Sorry, with that second C. I think the other piece that we had a conversation with Russell Colts, and he talked about teaching our boys to speak up when their peers are doing things that are not okay. So
Yes,
being able to
absolutely.
be critical of when, a boy is doing something inappropriate sexually to a female, but even
Yeah.
just speaking about females in ways that are not okay. So to
Yes,
be critical to
absolutely.
that too, not,
To be,
I
yes,
think
absolutely critical
speak up.
of all of the narratives. And in the other direction as well, like one example, like recently our local high school ran an op-ed in an opinion piece in their high school newspaper, which they were defending the phrase kill all men as being like an okay phrase to use like around school because it was kind of tongue in cheek, a pushback against patriarchy, whatever it was. And I'm like, okay, I think we need to do some critical thinking around this as well. It's actually not acceptable to have kill all men or kill all any identity group as used routinely in a school environment. And that's coming from the other direction. That is not okay. It's bullying. It's a form of bullying. So I think it's like we should call out boys' bad behavior towards girls and women, and we need to call out cultural bad behavior towards boys and men as well. So that's all part of this. And I think these conversations aren't clean, they're not easy, they're controversial, they're uncomfortable, but we need to be having them and we need to be getting them out in the open. And I think we need to do it in a way that is positive and generative for everybody and not just framing boys as these predators. I think there's a initiative in the UK at the moment which is let's teach boys not to like harm girls and women. Great, really important stuff. But I think we also need to be talking about the ways in which patriarchy harms men and boys as well, equally, and impossible expectations on boys, and get all of this out in the open. Talk about everybody's experience. So that critical thinking. And then the last one is care and connection, which is as I write in the book, there's this like chronic under nurture of boys starting in infancy, going all the way through childhood. We don't allow them a full emotional life. We don't give them the same kind of gentleness and tenderness that we give to girls. There was a really like an example of it. I just saw a couple well, yesterday, I think, in my social media feed that Scott Galloway, who has a very best-selling book about raising boys and men, he's there saying, I wish I'd had a daughter. So he has two boys, and he's like, I wish I'd had a daughter so I could show her that kind of tenderness and care. And like the implication is like, you can't show that kind of tenderness and gentleness to a boy. I'm not sure I got the exact phrasing right, but that was the implication of the clip. And it's like, boys are under-nurtured in that culture and in our culture, and the only way to teach someone to care for others is to care for them. People cannot be shamed into empathy and care. They have to learn it by experiencing it. That's true for everybody, and I think it's true on a very systemic level for boys and men. So you can't I think this is about offering emotional support, nuanced understanding, positive touch, just love and care and connection. And it is from that space that we will make change and not from a space of shame or blame.
Yes. And that it comes from both genders.
Yes, absolutely.
That sounds like a good place to stop, even though we could go on. But
Yeah.
we'll have resources in the show notes and links to your book and your Substack, which I love the title of your Substack, I Blame Society.
Yeah.
And we're so grateful that you're willing to join us,
It's been
share
such a
your great
pleasure.
knowledge and book and the work that you did.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you both. I'm going to hold up the book
Oh, there you
cover
go.
in case
Yeah,
anyone
there it
can see it.
is.
Yeah, there it is. No, thank you again.
All right. Take care.